I get asked a lot of questions. What's the threat? Who's doing it? Who is the best vendor I can buy products from? What about this active defence? How can we share information better? Now, these are all pretty good and indeed important questions. Indeed, the last question about information sharing is the topic that I have been asked to address this morning. Because I'm polite, I will of course do that for a few minutes. And then I want to talk about something else. You know, the one question that I have never been asked, and I mean never, is what does success look like? Or put another way, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? So that'll give you a hint about where I want to go after I talk about information sharing. So let me first attend to the duty that I have been invited to execute. As I see it, there are three barriers to information sharing between the private and the public sector, and indeed amongst the private sector. And it is really important that we solve this problem because cybersecurity is a quintessential team sport. As Alistair has said, this isn't about government. It's not just about industry. It's about all citizens. It's about all sectors of society playing a role. I think the first barrier is commercial sensitivity, an obvious dilemma. But if we are collectively to get ahead, we have to swap experiences and the lessons that we've learned. Now, I actually think there are some encouraging signs here. I think the banking industry should be congratulated for some initiatives they've recently taken to form together and to compare notes. And I think Telstra's recent public announcement about the compromise to its new acquisition, congratulations, PacNet, as well as its extensive interaction with its clients behind the scenes, have demonstrated real public leadership in this space. I struggle to think of too many Australian companies that have actually come forward like Telstra have recently. So, Mike, well done to you and your company. The second barrier I see is how we in government classify our information. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that we in government have to work much harder to declassify what we know and to get it out there to the people who can actually use it. Our next significant attempt at this will be to produce an unclassified report about the cyber threat across Australia. Now, there will be few surprises in this for cybersecurity experts, which I guess is most of you folks here. But it's not aimed at you. Well, in a way it is, in that what we're trying to do is what I want to do is to produce a resource for you, a comprehensive authoritative document that you can use to speak to executives, to boards, to those who just don't get it yet. So that's what we hope to do. That will be released later this month. I think the third barrier is the lack of mature systems and arrangements in place to exchange information securely and at net speed so things can be addressed as quickly as possible. That is why we in the Australian Cybersecurity Centre have invited formally 7 telcos and ISPs to join us in the centre. Now, this will be the start. I don't see this as the mature state. It'll take probably a little while yet before those folks join us, and we're going to learn together about how we exchange information for the benefit of our country. How do we do this at net speed? What does the information need to look like so that it is actionable? And I think in time I have a vision that your national centre will have footprints in each of our major capital cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, etc., where we can face-to-face build relationships and interact, in particular with industry. I suspect it'll be a little time before we get there yet. The new National Centre is only 6 months old, but that's my vision. You know, much of the current conversation space between industry and government is dominated by the topic of information sharing. It's important, I've said that. And we need to get to a better place. And you can expect to see more about the government's views on this when the cybersecurity review that has been commissioned by the Prime Minister gets released sometime later this year. But what I'm concerned about is that the conversation about how to go about things, such as information sharing, has crowded out the conversation about what it is we are trying to achieve. And it's that piece, the what is it that we're trying to achieve, that I want to focus the remainder of my remarks on. I want to start with a story. It's a very humble story. About 5 years ago, a member of the Defence Signals Directorate technical staff. Now, I'm conscious that some people here might know what the Defence Signals Directorate is or was. We're now called the Australian Signals Directorate, ASD. ASD is your government's most sophisticated technical espionage agency, but because we're good at that, we're also pretty good at protecting. So the bumper sticker is reveal their secrets, protect our own. And it's from the protect our own part of the business that this technical officer was from. And his name is Stephen Macleod. Stephen is one of the most richly talented and yet at the same time humble Australians I have ever had the privilege to meet. And I hope some of you here know him. Stephen was assisting a company, a very big Australian company, who had been the victim of cyber espionage. The compromise of the company was significant. The threat actor knew the board's decisions at the same time that the board did. But, you know, the company believed they'd been adequately protected. And you've heard this from a couple of our other speakers this morning. And because they believed they were adequately protected, they said that what had happened to them must have been some new and extremely sophisticated capability that had never been seen before. The reality was different. They were compromised with malware that had been around for many years. The malware was running unfettered across their network without their knowledge and indeed anything to prevent it. To top it off, all users on the compromised network had administrative privileges. So it was easy for the intruder to obtain the necessary credentials and mimic themselves as a system administrator, which they did, got a firm footwork very quickly. During a meeting with the company and Stephen, we explained the extent of the compromise. We got their attention. We get this a lot when we go to big companies, tell them what's going on. You know, the company's perceived security posture was way out of touch with the reality. The company's CIO asked Steve, hey, you know, what I really need from you is you to tell me what are the best vendor products out there that I can buy. And budget isn't an issue. There are a lot of zeros mentioned. Now, Steve's answer to the CIO surprised the CIO. Steve Macleod deduced that success for this particular company was prevention of compromise, pure and simple. So instead of suggesting specific products to buy, he started to talk about practical ways to improve their security posture. He suggested, and I can hear people saying it, application whitelisting. He explained how that would have caught the malware. He then said that the company was, like many others he'd been dealing with, a long way behind with its patching. The malware was old, as I've mentioned, and there were actually appropriate patches which were also years old to deal with it. He talked about the number of people who had administrative privileges. That afternoon, as Stephen was waiting for his flight to come back to Canberra, he started reflecting on the meeting that he'd had, and he realised this was the first time that DSD had provided some practical and prioritised advice, well, at least prioritised. So he started to make some notes of what he'd said. A few weeks later, he attended a meeting with another big company who had also been the subject of cyber espionage. He took the notes from the first meeting he had with him to this new meeting. And he sat there and listened to the company representatives explain their arrangements, how again, their posture was pretty good, this was new, sophisticated, tough. And Steve realised as he was hearing their sort of explanations that the advice he'd given a few weeks before was perfectly and equally applicable to this company. And he realised that he was onto something. He concluded that the advice he'd prepared earlier was not only applicable to the first company and to the second company, but actually it had wide application across industry and across governments. When he got back to Canberra that afternoon, and any of you who actually know Steve, you know he's a seriously hard-working fellow. So he worked into the night and he put his notes down into a spreadsheet. He ordered them and colour-coded them. And that spreadsheet was the very first version of what has become known as ASD's, or then DSD's, strategies to mitigate targeted cyber intrusions. It is not possible for me, and I wasn't there at the time, but it is not possible for me to be prouder of Stephen Macleod and the small team that worked with him. And I would like to acknowledge that Michael Burgess, whom you heard speak a couple of ago, was actually leading the organisation at that time. Their work, and in particular the brilliance of Stephen Macleod, is one of the great global success stories in cybersecurity. So said Alan Palla of SANS last week. And about a month ago, Kaspersky, I don't know if there's anyone from Kaspersky here, their Russian boss, many of you will know him, said something very similar about those mitigation strategies, and Kaspersky are using those to protect themselves. We update those strategies every 12 to 18 months, so we keep them live. But those top 4 strategies, the top 4, and I hope you all know about them. If not, I'll be around after morning tea and I'm very happy to repeat them for you. Those top 4 strategies remain the very best advice we can give. There is not a single compromise that we have dealt with, either of the Australian government or of big companies in Australia, not a single one, and we deal with some sophisticated ones, that would not have been prevented if those top 4 strategies had been implemented. Now, the key reason I believe that Steve got it right was because he started with what does success look like? And I'm glad he did. Because it had an impact on how our responsibilities to protect the national government from the threat through cyber. I spent a lot of time in the first few weeks of my appointment trying to work out what success looked like, trying to be able to explain what it was we were trying to achieve. The debates were often passionate, and we had things like to degrade our adversaries' capabilities, that's what we want to do. To raise the cost for our adversaries, that was a pretty common one. To make the Australian government a hard target, which sort of briefed well, but it was a bit hard to measure. After many weeks of debate, we settled on what success looked like. Now, in the spirit of information sharing, as I've been asked to talk about, I'm now going to share something with you that I haven't shared in public before. What success looked like was on the right-hand screen there. And as you can see, we set ourselves a time frame. When you see it, there's nothing startling about it. But the amount of effort that went into getting that right is quite extraordinary. Having achieved what we thought success looked like, and I should tell you, there are a lot of people that are uncomfortable with that, particularly the word no compromise. That means it can be measured. That means you can be held accountable. So a lot of folks felt uncomfortable. Actually, then working out how we were going to achieve that was much easier, having had the weeks of debate to get there. As you can see, we had 3 lines of activity. What we realised was that there were quite a few things that we were doing that wasn't going to get us to that end state. There were other things that we were doing that needed to be better synchronised in time to get us to that end state. And we realised there were things that we weren't doing but needed to do to get us there. Now, the first line of activity, I probably should use my graphics a bit better because it took up the vast majority of our organisational effort and energy. And it was about sovereign mitigation. It was about us. It was about an awareness campaign. It was about getting the top 4 implemented. It was about having the top 4 made mandatory for government organisations. It was about a regime to measure and audit the progress on the implementation of the top 4. It was about gateway sensor programs. None of these are particularly sexy things in the cybersecurity industry, but it's what we focused on. The other 2 lines of activity were about actions against our adversaries. Some other place, some other time, we might be able to talk about them. But those last 2 were much smaller efforts for us. The other thing that having worked out what success looked like, and then having worked out in a coordinated way how we were going to get there, gave us something else. Of course, it gave us coherence, but it also gave us a narrative. It gave us a simple, coherent narrative that we could explain to non-experts. People now knew what we were trying to achieve, how we were going to do it. And 2 things came out of that. 1, trust, confidence in us, and 2, resources. So the campaign approach has been very effective. Now, I think the next question reasonably to be asked of someone like me is, having asked me what does success look like, is how are you going? Well, here's how we're going. Now, you can see red bars against each year from 2009. Why have we picked 2009? Why haven't we got 2008? Answer, we didn't really know what was going on before 2009. When I say we didn't really know, we didn't have the data that we can have confidence in to produce a bar chart. What do these bars represent? They represent a combination of the number of compromises of the Australian government and the extent of those compromises. In other words, the higher the bar, the sadder the news. So you can see we've had some pretty ordinary years. Things started to turned for the better in 2012 as the awareness campaign started to get traction. But you can see that once we really focused on what we wanted to do, got all the elements together, what success looks like. Now, again, I've never shown this in a public forum, and I want to make a point very clear. No hubris. It is entirely possible that next week, even tomorrow, we can find out that actually 2013 was a disastrous year. And I'm going to have to change those bar charts, and I'll come back and apologise. That could well be the case. What I can say, though, why I've got a reasonable confidence in this, is that we are better now than we were a few years ago at picking up problems. The prevention measures that we put in place are vastly improved to what they were a few years ago. A few years ago, it would often take us 9 months to 12 months to identify that there had been a problem. Our recent experience is that it's measured more in weeks than months. So I have reasonable confidence, but I wouldn't be surprised, though I would be disappointed were there to be more problems we've identified in 2013 and 14. 2015 is turning out to be reasonably good for us too. So these are my messages for you. Sure, information sharing is important, and we got to do it better. We have to get to a better place. But what I want to invite you as the experts in this space to do is to think about what it is you are trying to achieve. You need to be able to describe, we need to be able to describe what success looks like. And if we can't, it means we've got to go back and we've got to do some more intellectual thinking about it. Success isn't really good information sharing. That's just a subset. And the final message I have for you, because sometimes we can be a bit melancholy about the scale of the problem here, is that you can be successful. You can get a handle on this thing. And our experience is, if success for you involves the retention and the integrity of your data, or the integrity and the retention of your organisation's reputation, then prevention works. And that is a living example of how it can. And like the other gentleman, I have not been afforded the opportunity for questions and answers, but I would be very glad to talk to any who would like to do that in the break. Thank you very much.